been encouraging you in class to use section headers as you write your lit reviews, and this will become useful as well as you continue through other parts of the paper. And so I want to show you some of the technicalities that Word offers in terms of formatting for your section headers, and a few particular tips and tricks that I think if you start doing now will help you significantly in the long run. So what you can see here is an example of a paper that I worked on with a colleague of mine and that we recently submitted to a journal. And I've put it into a very basic, simple formatting to be able to show you how some of this will work. But we used this in preparing our paper. So up here in the top of Word, under the Home heading, you will see there's several different options for style. You want to click on one of these heading options. So you'll see heading 1, if I hover over it, it gives me an example of what that would look like. Here's what heading 2 would look like, and so forth and so on. Now, when I showed this to you in class recently, I showed you how to use heading 1, and I think if I were to do it again, I would modify that. What you should do is use heading 1 for, as you can see here, the major sections of the paper. So here's my section on methods and data, and then I have above it a section that is my literature review, and that would be heading 1 as well. And the reason to do it this way is because eventually, though you've been working on these small parts, a lit review, a method section, and a timeline, eventually in the spring, you're going to have several sections that will be strung together that you'll have worked on in small components. So if you go ahead and now make heading 1 each section heading, and then the subheadings within each section heading level 2, that will probably streamline you a little bit when you go to combine things together. So if you click on the heading 1, it leaves it as the formatting for whatever you have for heading 1. Now, I've already preset my headings the way that I want them, but if you take the default and you're like, that's kind of ugly or weird, or for whatever reason you want to change it, the way to do that is right-click on the heading in question, and then you will see Modify on the list. Click on Modify, and then in this window, Modify Style, you can change any feature you want. So you see what I did for heading 1 was I left it in my favorite font, which is Garamond. I made it size 14, so it's a little bit bigger, but not too much, so it clearly stands out, but it's not going to overtake anything. You don't have to do that. You can leave it at size 12 if you want. I would recommend keeping it a similar font to what you have. You don't want to be too jarring with all that. But then what I do is I bold heading 1. And so the bold and the slightly increased font size help to clearly indicate here's a new section. You will notice down here that you have options for only in this document or new documents based on this template. I recommend that you say new documents based on this template because the idea is that you want to be able to use this across different documents. Ideally, create something that you think you might use across the board for most things you might write. If you do need to change anything, and you might, if it's Word's default, you might need to go into Format and click on Paragraph. These things on spacing might say some weird stuff. I recommend go ahead and change that to 0 for before and after, and then make line spacing double. And then you can click OK there, and click OK here, and that will be the default for the rest of the way through. So then, if we go back up to the beginning of my lit review in this paper, here we are. I didn't call it literature review, I called it something else. But my lit review in this case is called Forms of Capital and Accessing Local Food. So I come up here, I click on heading 1, and there we go. I've got heading 1 ready to go. Now, you'll also note over here, if you hover right on the left side of it, this little arrow that pops up, and if you click that arrow, it collapses the entire section down all the way to the next section header. But that way, you can, if you have a section that you're like, I'm done with this, I don't need to touch this anymore, you can collapse it to kind of get it out of the way so that you can focus more easily on the parts that you do need to work on. Now, within particular sections of the paper, within the lit review in particular for many of you, this is where really the heading levels start to come into play. But because you're using heading 1 for each section, I suggest that you use heading 2 for the subsections. Now, this particular lit review for this paper, I don't have subsections because I have a very short literature review because of the contours of this paper. But I have a lot going on in my methods section, and so I do have particular subheadings here. So I'm going to use my methods section as an example, but you can apply this to your lit reviews, and perhaps in the future, depending on how they develop, you might end up applying them to other parts of your paper as well as you see appropriate. So you see here in the methods and data section, I've got a paragraph that kind of overviews what's going on, and then I have a section on dependent variables, locations of locally oriented farms. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to come up to heading 2 and click on that. And this is also one that you can modify by right-clicking and saying modify. And you see what I've done here for heading 2 is I've said, let's use Garamond font, keep the same font. This time I've said same size font, so still size 12. And here I've made it bold and italics. So it's just a subtly different way of still offsetting to show this is a heading, that it stands out from the rest of the text, but a way of showing it is not quite as significant, or it is, shall we say, nested within the heading level that you had above. You might need to change the format for a paragraph. There's other stuff you can change too if you want, but usually you don't need to. Click OK to it, and it will be there for the rest of them. And you'll notice as well, with section 2, similar thing. You can collapse it, although I just collapsed the entirety of my paper, so let me undo that. And then if I scroll down here a little bit, oh, these should be centered. Don't worry about this right now. We'll talk about that later. That should be centered as well. And then here's a new section, independent variables, regional demographic measures. So I come back up to heading 2, click that. And so you can use this to be able to not only organize your paper, but and have consistency, but have things stand out clearly. If you do find that you need subheadings, so let's say that within, for example, my section here, which is kind of long on independent variables, let's say that I wanted to have subsections instead of for each paragraph where I've kind of bolded the word of what I'm talking about, race, education, median household income. Let's say for some reason I wanted to have a whole other section on median household income, but it's clearly something that is within the realm of independent variables. Well, that might be a time to use heading 3. And so heading 3, in this case, I just italicized it. But do what you need to. You probably don't need to go that far. If you do, that is probably the furthest you'll need to go. And hopefully that will help you all significantly in moving forward.